Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. We heard from our last lecture from Dr. Robinson. He talked about a group of people that will dominate in this area of the Near East, the Hittites. So we learned a little bit about at least what we know about their culture, where they were, of course, located, and a little bit about the Hittites. Today, Dr. Robinson will switch groups. He will discuss the Chaldeans, and he will also talk about the Assyrians in his upcoming lecture. Now, with the Assyrians were a little bit different from the other Mesopotamian groups that have been discussed in previous lectures. The Assyrians were a bit more brutal in nature, it seems. You'll learn about that. And also the Assyrians practiced mass deportations. They definitely weren't as tolerant of their conquered peoples as it seemed the other groups were. We've discussed in previous lectures the fact that when a group of people takes over the region in Mesopotamia, usually they'll just take over that culture, like the old Babylonians would take over the gods and the culture of the Sumerians. They might add to it with their own, stamp there, but they simply absorb the culture that already exists. Well, the Assyrians, of course, weren't quite so tolerant. And so you'll hear lots of stories about their fierceness and sometimes their brutality. The Assyrians actually will be responsible for destroying the city of Babylon at one point in their history. But just as with other groups of people that will come to power and dominate in Mesopotamia in the ancient Near East, the Assyrians cannot maintain control. Just as the others will fall, so do eventually the Assyrians. Their conquered peoples despise them, and they will eventually rise up in rebellion. Another group that Dr. Robinson will discuss more in depth when he begins his lecture are the Chaldeans. Chaldeans, also known as New Babylonians. The New Babylonians will come and dominate in Mesopotamia after the fall of the Assyrians around 612 BC. And the Chaldeans are of a Semitic. We've heard that word before in previous lectures. Semitic, it's related to a language group like Hebrew or Arabic, languages of that sort. And so these New Babylonians, or these Chaldeans as they're called, will dominate in this region as well. Some of the famous leaders that Dr. Robinson will probably mention, Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sure most of us we've heard of the name Nebuchadnezzar before, and his famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Very interesting, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And I can only imagine how magnificent, because this area, of course, is desert. In fact, the city of Babylon is eventually lost for a while. It's covered in sand. It's finally rediscovered in early 20th century. The actual ruins of the city of Babylon are discovered. The Chaldeans, as did most of the other groups in this region, will absorb the cultures that were previous to it. In fact, they will take over a lot of the religion of the old Babylonians. One thing that Dr. Robinson will probably discuss is the fact that the New Babylonians, the Chaldeans, were known for their study of astronomy or astrology, which was very interesting. They made a map of the heavens, which will be good for later generations, obviously. We see with a lot of these ancient peoples that they hope to foretell the future. In fact, not only the Chaldeans, but the Assyrians as well will practice what is called divination. And it's the practice of simply trying to foretell the future. Because, when you have this religion that's extremely pessimistic and negative, and as we've heard in a previous lecture, for example, the Sumerians, they would make sacrifices at the top of those ziggurats. And sacrifices, of course, like goats and such, not humans that we know of. They hoped the gods would be nice. But as we've discovered in a previous lecture, the gods didn't have to be nice. They didn't have to do good things just because you made that sacrifice. So it was a very pessimistic religion. So they hoped to predict the future, hoped they could find out what was happening. Divination is not just practiced in the ancient Near East, but it will, of course, be practiced by other groups as well. Basically, they would study the insides of slaughtered animals. And depending on shapes and such, they could predict maybe weather, or who was going to win the war, or who was going to win the battle, or something of that nature. Now, it seems that the Assyrians and the New Babylonians, those are the two main groups that Dr. Robinson is about to discuss more in depth coming up. Even the New Babylonians will not maintain power in this region, because eventually you'll hear about groups such as the Persians. Persians, of course, very important to the development of civilization, culture in this region as well. And of course, you'll also eventually hear about the Hebrews, also another very, very important group of people, especially with religion in Western civilization. So let's find out some interesting facts about the Chaldeans and the Assyrians.
Beginning in the 8th century BCE, a series of empires dominated the ancient world. First, that of the Assyrians, then the Chaldeans, then the Persians, then the empire of Alexander the Great, and finally that of the Romans. Today I want to talk about the first two, the Assyrians and the Chaldeans. And to talk about the Assyrians, we need to back up chronologically a bit and talk about their origins. The early Assyrians originated in northern Mesopotamia. And interestingly enough, there is still a remnant of that population in northern Iraq today, a group of Assyrian Christians who are now a minority. The term Assyria literally means the land of Assur. Assur was the Assyrian god of war. It was also the name of a fortified city on the Tigris River that was at times their capital city. Another of their most famous major cities was the city of Nineveh, which is about 100 miles north on the Tigris from Assur. Assyria had some things going for it, geographically speaking. It was relatively fertile, it had adequate rain, and there was stone there to use as a building material. On the other hand, it suffered from the problem that it was easily invaded. And so from very early on in their history, the Assyrians became a highly militaristic people. Early on, around 2300 BCE, they fell under the dominion of Sargon of Akkad, whom we talked about several lectures earlier. After being part of the Akkadian Empire, they later fell under the regime of the third dynasty of Ur. But about 2000 BCE, they became independent, and for the first time, it looked as though the Assyrians might begin to expand upon their own. They did enjoy a brief period of expansion, but just as they were reaching their stride, so to speak, about 1850 BC, they fell under the sway of the old Babylonian Empire, the Empire of Hammurabi. After about 2 centuries as part of that empire, they then fell under the dominion of the neighboring Mitanni and remained part of that people's empire for quite some time. In any case, throughout this time, there was constant fighting, gradually increasing the militarism that characterized the Assyrians. Then in the 14th century, the Egyptians defeated the Mitanni in battle and reduced the power of the Mitanni to the point that the Assyrians were able to return to independence and to begin the creation of the old Assyrian Empire. This happened between 1365 and 911 BCE. There was a period of expansion and then decline. One of the important figures in this early expansion was an Assyrian king by the name of Ashur-uballit I, who ruled from 1363 to 1330 and who began expanding the borders of Assyria once more. Then about 1200 BCE, the Assyrians got a lucky break when the Egyptians and the Hittites, who had long been at war with each other, gradually wore each other down to the point where neither was able to pose a threat to the Assyrians, and the Assyrians were able to expand even more. They shortly became dominant in the Mesopotamian region, ruling over virtually all of Mesopotamia. And in the 12th and early 11th centuries BCE, during the reign of a king named Tiglath-Pileser I, they expanded all the way to the Mediterranean. So, at this juncture, they had created a fairly sizable empire. But it was an empire that proved, at least this time around, to be fairly ephemeral. After the reign of Tiglath-Pileser I, the empire went into decline. The group of people known as the Aramaeans encroached upon their territory, and they went into eclipse for a considerable period. Then, about 911 BCE, we see the beginnings of what historians called the Neo-Assyrian or New Assyrian Empire. This is the one that is truly famous. This is the one that is frequently referenced in the Old Testament of the Bible by the Hebrews. They were to become the dominant power in the Near East. They were characterized by their extraordinarily brutal methods in combat, offering massacring entire peoples or putting them to death in really horrendous ways, crucifixion, impalement, flaying alive, and so on, something in which they in fact took a good deal of pride. They're also one of the first people we know to practice what we nowadays call ethnic cleansing, deporting whole groups of people from one part of the empire to another, often for the purposes of enslaving them. At the same time, however, there was a kind of silver lining in this cloud, in that along with spreading their influence, they also spread the culture of Mesopotamia. Oddly enough, although the Assyrians were an intensely militaristic people and often extraordinarily brutal and cruel, they also appreciated the finer things of civilization and took them with them wherever they went. Now, before I talk about individual Neo-Assyrian kings, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Assyrian kingship and some of the other aspects of Assyrian society and the Assyrian state. The king of Assyria was a very, very powerful man. Among other things, he represented the god Assur, who was the chief god among the Assyrians, and remember, the god of war. The kings of Assyria conducted annual military campaigns. It was not a question of will we go to war, it was merely a question of against whom. Campaigning took place usually during the more temperate months, but kings kept themselves occupied in military trim by hunting most of the rest of the year. And this was not easy hunting that they did. The favorite sport of the Assyrian kings was hunting lions from horseback with a spear. And if you'll just visualize that for a few minutes, you'll get the notion that Assyrian kings were pretty tough guys. In addition to their kingly and military functions, they also exercised a priestly function. They presided over religious celebrations, including the celebration at the New Year. They also conducted various rituals during the year, and they also interpreted the prophecies of oracles, thereby predicting the future. The king usually had a number of wives, but he had a particular wife who was recognized as his queen, and the queen was always the mother of the king's heir. However, the heir was not always the eldest son, as you might expect from later medieval society. the Assyrian king actually chose which son was to succeed him, which sometimes led to trouble. Not surprisingly, at the peak of Assyrian society was the royal family. Obviously, the king and his family would be at the top. After them came 4 social classes, you might call them. The first of these was the nobility, the aristocrats. And from this group of people were drawn almost all of the important royal officials, officers in the army, high-ranking officials in the government, and so on. Even some of the higher priests came from the nobility. Next came what we might think of as a middle class, people who were merchants, people who were craftsmen, who were lawyers and physicians, and what have you. And then below the middle class, there were actually 2 classes of people additionally. Soldiers, regular non-commissioned soldiers, and agricultural workers constituted the next to last class. One group who fought, the other group who fed those who fought. And finally, at the bottom of Assyrian society were the slaves. Now, interestingly enough, among the Assyrians, slaves were usually people who were being punished for a crime or who had been captured in war. And given the brutality of the Assyrians, you might expect that the slaves would have been treated truly awfully. But in fact, Assyrian slaves did have some rights. They could acquire property of their own, and some of them, who happened to be educated, could even hold minor jobs in Assyrian society. This is not to say that there's very much good about being a slave, but there were even gradations of slavery in the ancient world. Assyrian law, again, not surprisingly, is based on that of Hammurabi. The Assyrians, after all, came to dominate Mesopotamia, an area that Hammurabi had earlier dominated himself, and so they adopted much of his legal code. There were, however, some differences. One difference is that the penalties in Assyrian law were even more severe. And considering that the penalties under Hammurabi were hardly gentle, that's saying quite a lot. Another thing has to do with what the Assyrians regarded as the worst crimes. The 2 worst crimes you could commit among the Assyrians were abortion and homosexuality. But moral issues had absolutely nothing to do with this. It was not a question of morality in either case. Rather, both abortion and homosexuality affected the birth rate. It was the duty of all Assyrians to produce children. Sons who would grow up to be soldiers, daughters who would grow up to be the wives and mothers of more soldiers. Abortion prevented that, so also did homosexuality. Abortion, in fact, could be punished among the Assyrians by being impaled alive on a stake. Homosexuality was a little bit more problematic. In some cases, it was allowed, for example, with temple prostitutes, but among ordinary people, this was not the case. Again, everything is oriented towards the military. So anything that stops the production of more soldiers is regarded as bad. Another thing about Assyrian law, and this is fairly typical of the ancient world, but the Assyrians take it to unusual lengths, is that women were entirely subjected. Women had virtually no rights whatsoever under the Assyrian people. The Assyrians had a regular standing army, a fairly unusual thing in the ancient world, in fact, a fairly unusual thing into modern times. And it was the most powerful army that anyone had fielded in the ancient world thus far. One reason was that the Assyrians were tough and disciplined and trained constantly. But another very important reason was that beginning in about the 9th century, they began using iron weapons, becoming the first army to do so on a systematic basis. They learned how to make iron from the Hittites, they applied that to their weaponry, and this gave them an advantage in kind of an ancient arms race over people who were using less effective weapons. The army itself was divided up into 4 different types of soldiers. There was the light infantry, those individuals who carried slings, which were used to throw stones, and who carried bows, which were used to fire arrows. Then there was the heavy infantry, who were more heavily armored and who carried swords and shields and spears. Then, and especially early on, there was a corps of charioteers, individuals who fought in 2-wheeled chariots in which there would be a driver and 3 or 4 other individuals who either wielded bows or spears or swords, and who could be quite devastating when rolling through a mass of infantry. And finally, developing fairly late among the Assyrians was the Assyrian cavalry, which became quite effective in the later conquests of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were very capable horsemen. They were also very good cavalry. One of the interesting things about them is that in almost every case they rode bareback, which of course requires an enormous amount of skill. Another thing that accounts for the Assyrian success is that they were extremely good engineers. They inherited the mathematical developments of earlier Mesopotamian civilizations, and they applied them to practical purposes. When it comes to building fortresses, or to bringing down somebody else's fortress by undermining the walls or what have you, having a good engineer available is extraordinarily important. They also became experts at siege warfare, at surrounding a city and starving it into submission. And the Assyrians made deliberate use of what we might call psychological terror. They set out to inflict the most fearsome sorts of injuries on their enemies so that future enemies would surrender rather than putting up a fight. In some instances, they would take all the inhabitants of a city and kill them. In one case, they did this by flaying the individuals alive and then displaying their skins on the wall of the city. They also inflicted all sorts of other horrific tortures on people, and this was quite effective. It did indeed lead to people surrendering to the Assyrians without putting up a fight, rather than losing and falling into their hands. When it came to Assyrian religion, they were again influenced by earlier Mesopotamian civilizations, especially by the Babylonians. Many of the earlier Babylonian gods were part of the Assyrian pantheon. The most important god, again, was Assur, the god of war. But there were also many others, including some gods going all the way back to the time of the Sumerians. Another thing that was an important aspect of Assyrian religion is that they had a very deeply entrenched belief in demons, that is, in malevolent spirits who tried to cause harm to human beings. And as a result of that, they did all sorts of things to try to keep this from happening, either by using charms to ward off the demons or by making offerings to the demons that would appease them. The one that frightened them the most was a female demon by the name of Lamashtu, who was believed to steal newborn infants. Now think about that. We would find that horrifying as well, having a newborn infant stolen. But it ties back into that whole military orientation of their thinking. If newborn infants are stolen, they don't grow up to become Assyrian soldiers. Another aspect of Assyrian religion, not unique by any means to the Assyrians, in fact it's fairly common in ancient religion, was the practice of divination. That is, of trying to predict the future by examining various things in nature. One of the things that Assyrian soothsayers or prophets did was to try to predict the future by examining the livers of sheep. I wouldn't suggest this as a way of planning your future, but it was widely believed among the Assyrians that a knowledgeable person could look at the liver of a sheep and tell what was coming in the future. Another way that they sought to predict the future, also common in the ancient world, was through the interpretation of dreams, an exercise that remains highly problematic even today in the hands of a competent psychologist. And, like many ancient people, they tried to predict the future through astrology. That is, through watching the movements of the stars, the planets, the sun, and the moon, and other celestial objects, and attempting to divine meaning from that. Assyrian medicine, not surprisingly, was very good. If you send soldiers into the field every year, you want them to be well soldiers, fit soldiers, soldiers who are able to fight. Soldiers who get wounded need to be healed. Soldiers who get sick need to be made well. And the interesting thing about the Assyrians, like most ancient people, they saw disease as having supernatural causes, among other things, demons. But they at the same time recognized a lot of the natural processes of disease that we know now. They understood what doctors call the etiology of a disease, how the disease begins, how it reaches a crisis, how that crisis is resolved, either with healing or death, and so on. And they became very good at treating disease based upon the symptoms. They had a good understanding of symptomology. They also knew how to do a lot of relatively simple medical procedures. No, they didn't do brain surgery or heart bypasses, but they could do a lot of simple operations that saved a great many lives and sent a great many soldiers back to the battlefield. And they were extremely good with their pharmacology. They knew a number of medicinal preparations that worked. Now, of course, they knew quite a few that probably didn't work so well. Some of them look quite bizarre to us now, but they knew enough that did work that they were able to cure infections and treat a number of different kinds of problems. Assyrian art, again, this should be no surprise by now, had as its number one subject military conquest, and as number two, kings hunting lions. No surprise there. But in spite of that, although much of the art was concerned with military purposes, it's extremely good. It's some of the best art produced in the ancient world. And they didn't just glorify military things. The Assyrians made very delicate and exquisite jewelry out of gold and ivory and what have you, and had quite an artistic bent. They also built enormous and elaborate royal palaces for their kings that were real architectural wonders at the time. One of the things that characterized these palaces and other important buildings among the Assyrians was the creation of what are known as portal figures. Figures that were put by portals, that is doors, to guard them against, among other things, malevolent supernatural forces. The most common of these portal figures that you find are lions or bulls, which are winged. And you can find a number of images of this, a number of sculptures of this sort in the British Museum and in other places where Assyrian artwork is preserved. Still another thing that they were quite good at was at carving reliefs, that is, carving images into stone. This is where we find a number of the images of Assyrian kings and also of various scenes of battle, scenes of hunting, and what have you. All right, so a Neo-Assyrian empire begins around 911 BCE and flourishes down until about 612. The man who began this all was a king by the name of Adad-Nirari II, who ruled from 911 to 891 BCE. Under Adad-Nirari II, the Assyrians began to expand eastward, going east of the Tigris River, conquering a good deal of territory there, taking over a number of the trade routes east of the Tigris, and driving the Aramaean people out of Mesopotamia so that they controlled it exclusively themselves. A few years down the road, Adad-Nirari's grandson, whose name was Assur-narsapal II, began conquering territory to the west of Mesopotamia, and once again extended Assyrian control all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, conquering many of the smaller kingdoms between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean. He is a good example of an individual who was particularly savage in his treatment of enemies and of those he conquered, and who took a good deal of pride in this, bragging about it on steles, large stones that he erected with inscriptions describing what he had done. He also is the first individual that we know of to practice deportation or ethnic cleansing. And he built a major new city in Assyria, a city known as Kalu, or what is nowadays known as the city of Nimrod. His son, who followed him, was a king by the name of Shalmaneser III. He began to campaign into Syria and also into Palestine, and was well on his way towards conquering territory in both when a common plague of conquering emperors showed up at his doorstep, so to speak. Revolts broke out at home, and he had to abandon his expedition and go home and put down the revolts. Thereafter, it looked as though this latest bout of Assyrian imperialism might be coming to an end, might prove to be sort of a flash in the pan like earlier episodes. In fact, the neighboring state to the northeast of Urartu began to encroach on Assyrian territory, and then around 745, the Assyrians began one more final and their greatest wave of expansion. This began with a king known as Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned from 745 to 727. One of his first major achievements was to capture the city of Babylon, which was now occupied by a people sometimes called the Neo-Babylonians, the New Babylonians, but who are often referred to, particularly in the Old Testament of the Bible, as the Chaldeans. He also drove Urartu out of his territory and out of Syria. And he went down and ravaged the kingdom of Israel. Did not conquer it, but he did inflict a great deal of damage on it. And by the time he reached the peak of his power, Tiglath-Pileser III ruled a territory that stretched from the Taurus Mountains in the north all the way down to the border of Egypt in the south, and that included everything from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. He also was an innovator when it comes to organization, introducing organizational tricks that would later be imitated by the Persians, by Alexander, and by the Romans. For example, he was a great road builder, recognizing the importance of roads to effective communication, to effectively moving troops around, and so on. He instituted a postal service so that he could reliably get messages from one place to another in his kingdom. Of course, that benefited not only him, but everybody else. He also subdivided his empire into smaller units and either used local native kings who were loyal to him to govern locally, or he appointed governors who were Assyrians. Either way, this led to a greater degree of organization and a more effective administration of his empire. Tiglath-Pileser was followed by his son Shalmaneser V, who found himself opposing an unusual alliance put together by Israel and Egypt, who until recently had been enemies. What brought things to a head is that the kingdom of Israel refused to pay tribute to Shalmaneser V, and he retaliated against this by invading Israel and conducting a 3-year-long siege of the region known as Samaria. In 722, the kingdom of Israel fell to Shalmaneser V, and as we know both from Assyrian sources and from the Old Testament, in that year he took away 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel who were lost to history thereafter, And they, of course, from the standpoint of what we're talking about, represent an example of ethnic cleansing or mass deportation, but they become known to history as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, never really seen again. Shalmaneser was followed by a king known as Sargon II, not a family member, and therefore probably someone who usurped the throne. He very self-consciously took the name of Sargon of Akkad, a king from hundreds and hundreds of years earlier, but clearly what he was appealing to was the grandeur and the memory of Sargon amongst Mesopotamian people. In fact, he and his successors are often referred to as the Sargonid dynasty in Assyria. He built a new capital at what he called Dur-Sharrukin, or what is nowadays the city of Khorsabad. In 714 BCE, he conquered what was left of Urartu, and in 705, as the Cimmerian people were invading Mesopotamia, he drove them out and diverted them westward into Anatolia, or what is nowadays Turkey. Sargon was followed by a son, again well known to readers of the Old Testament, called Sennacherib. Sennacherib rebuilt Nineveh as the capital of Assyria, and it remained the most important Assyrian city thereafter. He also went down and besieged the other Hebrew kingdom, the kingdom of Judea, which contained the remaining 2 tribes of the Hebrews, and laid siege to the city of Jerusalem itself during the reign of the Hebrew king Hezekiah. He also conducted wars with the Neo-Babylonians or Chaldeans and with their neighbors to the east, the Elamites. And at the climax of this war, Sennacherib committed what was considered by his own people, by his own Assyrian people, to be a horrible, horrible sacrilege. He destroyed the entire city of Babylon, and he stole the gods of the Chaldean people. That is, he stole the images of the gods of the Chaldeans from their temples and carried them away to Nineveh. Most importantly, the god Marduk, but also others as well. This was going too far even for the Assyrians. The Assyrians were horrified by this. Everyone else was horrified by this. Indeed, his own family was horrified by this. And in 681, he was murdered by 2 of his own sons, who were so outraged that they could not allow their father to live. Now, of course, murdering your father, especially if your father is a king, is also considered an outrage. And the 2 brothers had a younger sibling by the name of Esarhaddon, who Sennacherib had identified as his heir. They didn't much like that, but neither did he much like the fact that they had killed his father and theirs. And so he drove them out of Assyria and succeeded Sennacherib as king in 681. To make up for his father's great sacrilege in destroying Babylon, he rebuilt the city, and he continued to expand Assyria's influence, and in 671 actually conquered Egypt, which at that point was under the control of a line of Nubian pharaohs. So this is where the Assyrian Empire reaches its maximum extent. It actually now includes not only all that territory from the Taurus down to Egypt, only all that territory from east of the Tigris to the Mediterranean, it now also includes Egypt itself. But that was to be short-lived. Soon after the conquest of Egypt, a Nubian leader by the name of Taharka rebelled against the Assyrians, and Esarhaddon was on his way to fight against Taharka and to try to reclaim his control when he died of some illness in 669 BCE. He was succeeded in turn by the last great Assyrian king, Yet again, another one familiar from the Old Testament, Assurbanipal. Assurbanipal managed to reconquer part of Egypt, the Delta region around Memphis and going on down the Nile. But closer to home, Assurbanipal had serious problems. Once again, problems with a sibling. He had a brother whose name was Shamash Shum Ukin, who was a younger brother, and their father had put Shamash Shum Ukin in charge of Babylon, in charge of ruling the city of Babylon under his brother. Well, Shamash Shum Ukin had bigger ideas. He desired to become king of Assyria himself and to overthrow his older brother Assurbanipal. And so he allied himself with the Chaldeans, over whom he was supposed to be ruling, with the Elamites to the east, and to the Egyptians who his brother had just reconquered. And in 652, he attacked the Assyrians, attacked his own brother, and waged war against him for 4 years. As it turned out, this was not successful. Assurbanipal proved to be too much for his brother, and the upshot of it was that Shamash Shum Ukin actually threw himself into a burning building rather than falling into the hands of his brother, which tells you he must have been expecting something pretty tough if he fell into his brother's hands. Thereafter, Assurbanipal punished those who had opposed him, including the Chaldeans, and most particularly the Elamites. He went into the country of Elam and absolutely decimated it, which might seem like, from his point of view, a brutal but strategically smart thing to do. However, it turned out to be a big mistake. By ravaging Elam, by reducing the power of the Elamites, he created what was essentially a power vacuum in Elam. He didn't have sufficient men to occupy Elam himself, and he left it very weak, which is going to have some serious consequences in just a moment. First, though, let me tell you something about Assurbanipal's library. Again, this is an example of how the Assyrians combined this militaristic brutality with a great love of culture. There certainly was no more militaristic ruler of Assyria than Assurbanipal. But he also built a library for himself which contained over 20,000 cuneiform tablets, including many of the great works of literature of the time, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and all sorts of things that have been lost to us since, many of them Babylonian. That's quite an achievement. Now, unfortunately, once Assurbanipal had passed out of the picture, things began to go downhill pretty quickly. In fact, they did so almost immediately. He died in 627, and in 626 BCE, trouble erupted in a major way. Down in southern Mesopotamia, among the people known as the Chaldeans, was a local figure known as Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar previously had worked for the Assyrians, but in 626 he rebelled against them. Now, to make matters worse, he allied himself with a people to the east in what is nowadays the state of Iran, particularly with the people known as the Medes and with a Median king by the name of Cyaxares. So you have the Medes attacking Assyria from the east, the Chaldeans attacking the Assyrians from the south, and to make matters worse, a group of people, semi-nomadic people from the north called the Scythians, now invaded Assyria from the north. The Egyptians, who had just been fighting the Assyrians, were so horrified by this upsurge of Chaldeans and Medes and Scythians, that they actually backed the Assyrians up. But it was to no avail. After Assurbanipal, there were really no effective Assyrian leaders. Nabopolassar and Cyaxares, on the other hand, were quite capable, and a series of bitter defeats now befell the Assyrians. First of all, the city of Assur fell in 614. Then in 612, the cataclysmic fall of the city of Nineveh, which was almost completely destroyed. Then in 610, the fall of Haran. And by this point, Nabopolassar, the Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean, had in fact made himself king over virtually all of Assyria and the rest of Mesopotamia. The Chaldeans were a Semitic people who wound up creating an empire of their own, short-lived though it was. Nabopolassar was not only allied with the Medes, he also cleverly persuaded them to move beyond Assyria into Anatolia and to leave Assyria to him. His main problem was with the Egyptians. And in 605, he sent his son, whose name you're bound to recognize, down to deal with the Egyptians, a son by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Again, one of the great villains from the Hebrew point of view of the Old Testament. Nebuchadnezzar went down and defeated the Egyptians in 605 at the Battle of Carchemish. The same year his father died, and Nebuchadnezzar found himself as the ruler of the new Chaldean or Neo-Babylonian Empire. Now it's interesting to reflect what a sense of history people in this region have. Nebuchadnezzar very consciously fashioned an image of himself for public consumption as the new Hammurabi. More recently, Saddam Hussein, who ruled in Iraq as a dictator and who you no doubt recall, fashioned himself as the new Nebuchadnezzar. Now Nebuchadnezzar himself carried on further conquests, subduing all of Mesopotamia, all of Syria, Palestine, and surrounding territory. It was Nebuchadnezzar who finally conquered the Hebrew kingdom of Judea, and who in 586 destroyed the Hebrew temple, and who carried off the leading citizens of Judea to Babylon into what came known as the Babylonian captivity. That is Nebuchadnezzar who does that. Needless to say, he is not thought well of by the Hebrews. After a brief interlude upon Nebuchadnezzar's death, he was followed by a non-relative by the name of Nabonidus. And here's an interesting point. There are a number of times when the Old Testament refers to Nebuchadnezzar as being mad, as being insane. Much of that actually refers to Nabonidus, who does seem to have been mad and who was sometimes confused with his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. One of the stranger things he did, either through really bad policy or madness, is that he abandoned Babylon altogether and went to live in Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar in charge of Babylon. This turned out to be an especially bad idea because in 539, when Belshazzar was in charge of Babylon, who should show up at its gates but Cyrus the Great, the Persian conqueror, who overwhelmed Belshazzar, who conquered the Chaldean Empire, and went on to rule an even greater empire than any of those that had existed before. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Chaldean culture. Although the Chaldean Empire was short-lived, and although the Chaldean emperors have a less than sterling reputation, the Chaldeans do contribute significantly to Western culture. The city of Babylon itself reached the height of its magnificence during the time of Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar, and Nabonidus. There they built the magnificent Ishtar Gate to the city, so named for the goddess Ishtar, several stories high, elaborately decorated, a truly spectacular thing. Nebuchadnezzar also built a palace that was very grandiose, very magnificent. He built a temple for Marduk called the Asaglia, and a ziggurat where other gods were worshipped called the Etemenanki, which may very well be the same edifice referred to in the Old Testament as the Tower of Babel. And it was under Nebuchadnezzar that the famous hanging gardens of Babylon were built. They weren't literally hanging, but it was a multi-tiered, multi-story set of gardens that was considered to be one of the wonders of the ancient world. The Chaldeans themselves were a multilingual people. They spoke Aramaic, but they kept records in the old Neo-Akkadian language. One of the most interesting things about the Chaldeans, as with a lot of ancient people, is their religion. But not just their religion per se, also some of the things that come from it. It, too, is based on earlier Babylonian religion. Unlike the Assyrians, their chief god was not Assur, their chief god was the older Babylonian god Marduk, although they worshipped a number of gods. In fact, the Chaldeans had what is called an astral religion. They believed that the sun and the moon and all the stars and all the planets are in fact gods. And they, because of the distance from Earth of the sun and moon and stars and planets, they came to regard their gods as rather remote, as rather inscrutable, as rather difficult to know. Interestingly, the Chaldeans, like a lot of earlier Mesopotamian people, had a rather pessimistic outlook on life. Curiously, though, they sang hymns to their gods, they prayed to their gods, even if they weren't sure they were going to get an answer, and they devoted an enormous amount of attention to trying to figure out what their gods were up to. How did they do that? By watching them. By practicing, again, astrology. By deliberately charting the movements of the stars and the planets and the moon and the sun, and attempting to divine patterns there, to predict the future there. Many of the astrologers that you read about in the Old Testament are in fact Chaldean astrologers attempting to predict the future. One of the things that they did in order to keep track of which gods to be keeping up with on a particular day is that they invented the 7-day week. Now, you might not have thought about that before, but the week is not a naturally occurring unit. The month is, sort of, if it's based on the moon, even though that doesn't work too well, as we've seen, but the week is a totally arbitrary construct. The week could just as easily be 6 days or 8 days or 10 days, but they chose 7. And that stuck. That 7-day week is passed down to subsequent cultures, and we still have it now. So if you want to blame somebody next Monday morning when you get up not feeling really ready to go to work or school, blame the Chaldeans. But to be fair, if you're having fun next Saturday night, you need to thank them for that too. Now, one of the upshots of their obsession with astrology, with watching the stars and planets and so on for the purpose of predicting the future and divining the acts of the gods, is that they accidentally created an awful lot of astronomical data. The Chaldeans were keeping meticulous records of the sky long before they created an empire and for quite some time after their empire fell apart. So there's over 300 years of very accurate records of the movements of the stars and planets, of eclipses, of comets, and what have you, which astronomers today still find extremely valuable. Although they used a lunar calendar, they understood the solar year. They became quite adept at predicting eclipses, and of course if you can predict an eclipse, that makes you look pretty good in terms of being able to predict the future. So they are a very, very important people. I want to conclude by talking just for a moment about a group of people who were the Chaldeans and earlier the Assyrians' neighbors. A smaller kingdom, but one that nonetheless has a good deal of influence for a short time. And that is a group of people called the Lydians. That's Lydian with a D in the middle. The Lydians occupied western Anatolia, or the western part of what is nowadays the country of Turkey. They had been there for a long time. The early history of their dynasty is obscure. We began to have something like concrete information about them with the rule of a semi-legendary king by the name of Gyges, who shows up in a lot of Greek sources and who ruled there from 685 to 652 BC. He founded the Mermnad dynasty, as it's known, in Lydia, and he also began expanding into the westernmost part of Anatolia, which is called Ionia, and which was occupied at the time by the Greeks. He died in 652 in warfare with the Cimmerians. He was succeeded not immediately by any great king. There is a gap before another strong one comes along. But about 610, a Lydian king named Alyattes comes along who makes Lydia into a fairly major power and actually fought a significant war against the Medes, the people who preceded the Persians in Iran and who were expanding into Anatolia themselves. Interestingly, what stopped this war was an eclipse. In 585, there was a long, particularly dark solar eclipse, and it so frightened both armies that they decided to make peace rather than to continue fighting. And thus they divided Anatolia between them, using the Halys River as a border. The Lydians controlled the western side, the Medes controlled the east. And that finally brings us to the most famous of the Lydian kings, again one who has become sort of semi-legendary, a king by the name of Croesus, who was the son of Alyattes. Croesus has become part of a figure of speech. The Lydians were notoriously wealthy because their part of Anatolia had a lot of gold and silver mines. And one of the things that the Lydians introduced to the Western world was metal coinage made from gold and silver with the images of their rulers on them. The phrase rich as Croesus came to mean in the ancient world, and it still does among people familiar with the expression, as rich as you can possibly be. And Croesus certainly was rich. He continued the conquest of the Ionian Greeks in western Anatolia. He also allied himself with the Greek city-state of Sparta and seemed to be well on his way to creating quite a large state for himself. He also began deliberately adopting Greek culture, which he regarded as superior to that of the Lydians, and he even went so far as to build a temple to the Greek goddess Artemis in the city of Ephesus. Now, as I mentioned, the Lydians were quite wealthy. They also were noted for their music, although unfortunately none of it survives. And they built great citadels, none of them greater than the citadel at Sardis. The citadel at Sardis became the center of Croesus's power. And in 546, Croesus discovered to his alarm that a large Persian army, the Persians having overwhelmed the Medes, was marching his way, led by none other than Cyrus the Great. Croesus was unsure what to do, and so he went and consulted a Greek oracle, the oracle at Delphi. Oracles, as you will find out when you hear more about the Greeks, are notorious for speaking in vague terms, for speaking in riddles. And supposedly, according to the legend, when Croesus asked the oracle at Delphi what would happen if he went to war with Cyrus, the oracle responded, "You will destroy a great army." This sounded like exactly what Croesus wanted to hear, and he went to war with Cyrus. He did indeed destroy a great army. Unfortunately for the Lydians, that army was his own, and Cyrus became the ruler of the Lydians. In the next lecture, we'll talk more about the Persians, Cyrus the Great, and his successors.
Hello. Well, it seems that we found out some very interesting facts about these two new groups of people that will become very powerful at different times or certain times in ancient Mesopotamia. Yeah, Dr. Robinson talked about the religions of these two groups. Also talked about some of their culture, how they handled their law. I mentioned the Assyrians and, of course, the influence of Hammurabi's, the old Babylonian ruler Hammurabi's, his code of laws that existed as well. Society. Dr. Robinson talked to us about society by both of these peoples, how they lived, as far as, the evidence that we know. If they had armies, of course, we know the Assyrians did because they were pretty fierce. Used the chariots. They pretty much wiped people off the face of the earth as they moved through and conquered their neighbors. Astrology, also talking about astrology and the use of looking into the heavens to try and predict the future as well. Not just divination like I had mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, but also astrology. Seems to be very important to not only the Assyrians, but also the New Babylonians. Medicine. It's always interesting to find out how, especially with the Assyrians, what did they know? Did they believe that medicine was, disease was supernatural, or was there a reason for it? So that was interesting that we found out the answers to that as well. And art and architecture for both the Assyrians and the Chaldeans. And of course, Dr. Robinson mentioned some very important people associated with these two groups as well. Well, our next lecture that we will hear about has to do with another group of people that will create an empire in this region. They're mainly settled in what is present-day Iran. So they are a little bit to the east of the Tigris and the Euphrates, or Mesopotamia, but this group of people will eventually spread across Mesopotamia. They'll even fight the Greeks at one time in history. So when we come back, we'll find out more about the Persians. Until next time.